Dear viewers, today we are going to discuss Fanon's theory of national consciousness. In simple words, national consciousness is a strong feeling of commitment that enables a citizen to work for the progress of his nation. It motivates the individual to place the interest of the nation above personal, ethnic, religious, or tribal interest. In his book The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon argues that national consciousness is essential for the achievement of true independence. According to Fanon, construction of national consciousness is heavily dependent upon important cultural activities. National consciousness and national culture go hand in hand, so anti-colonial resistance cannot succeed without them. Fanon is of the view that native intellectual can play a vital role in the development of national consciousness. Native intellectual is an intermediary between the colonizer and the colonized. He has to bridge the gap between both parties. The native intellectual has to advance the cause of his nation. Fanon relates the evolution of national consciousness to the growing maturity of native intellectual. Fanon prescribes the following phases for the evolution of national consciousness. During the first phase, the native intellectual attempts unqualified assimilation. It implies that he is inspired by the culture of the colonizing power. Therefore, he ignores the cultural traditions of the colonized nation and aspires to reproduce the cultural fashions of the colonizing power. In this way, the native intellectual is estranged from the indigenous masses. He identifies with the colonizing power instead of identifying with the victims of colonialism. In the second phase, the native intellectual grows dissatisfied with copying the colonizer and instead becomes immersed in the cultural history of the people. During this stage, the native intellectual becomes too concerned with cherishing the past and ignores the struggles taking place in the present. Indigenous cultural traditions are venerated, but the derogation of the colonized is still not challenged. Fanon advises that glorification of the culture of the past is not enough. Rather, a new way of mobilizing inherited culture is required. This brings us to the third phase or fighting phase, in which the native intellectual becomes directly involved in the people's struggle against colonialism. In this phase, he becomes conscious of his previous estrangement from the people and realizes that it is not enough to try to get back to the people in that past out of which they have already emerged. Rather than cherishing inert cultural tradition, a more dynamic relationship is attempted between the cultural inheritance of the past and the people's struggle against colonialism in the present. Therefore, traditional culture is mobilized as part of the people's fight against oppression. Consequently, it is transformed in the process. At this point, the native intellectual must participate in the reinterpretation of traditional culture in the present with the aim of opening up the possibility of a new future. Fanon gives the example of oral storytellers who modify their work in order to participate in the forging of national consciousness. Through the modification of traditional culture, the artist plays a key role in the people's struggle for independence. He not only draws inspiration from the people, but also compacts a sense of people's national unity. Rather than cherishing the most valuable cultural treasures, the native intellectual strives to modify, reinterpret, and reform traditional culture in order to forge a new national consciousness. Hence, unusual forms of artistic expression emerge in this phase. These new forms contribute to the dynamism of the people who are already striving for change. In these terms, traditional culture undergoes radical revision. The struggle against colonialism sends culture along different paths. It is the responsibility of the native intellectual to follow these new paths to the future. In this way, he can participate in the burgeoning national culture, rather than retrace the steps back to an ossified and inert past which takes him away from the dynamism of the people's struggle. Crucial to Fanon's understanding of national culture is the rendering of culture as dynamic and responsive to historical circumstances. There can be no return to an idealized notion of culture as in negritude. Native intellectuals must become a part of the day to day struggle of the people in order to forge national consciousness and culture. It will unite the intellectuals and the masses, but the people's cultural inheritance remains a fundamental resource in forging national culture, one which is brought into play with the necessities of the present. So, a sense of collective action is fundamental to the sustenance of the nation. It is because of the fact that nation is the political manifestation of all the people. Some people question Fanon's theory on the following grounds. Like all prescriptive political programs, Fanon's model of national culture itself contains an element of idealism. One particular problem concerns the relations between the Western educated native intellectual and the people. One wonders if the native intellectual can learn from the people, as Fanon demands. In his essay, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, Fanon warns of the dangers ahead for the colonized nations if their native intellectuals become compradors and betray the people in the interests of the few. His argument for the construction of a national consciousness that reflects the needs of the people applies both before and after independence is achieved. The achievement of self-determination by the people's struggle is only a first step. The newly independent nation must conduct itself in the best interests of the people if all are to remain permanently free from colonial rule. To conclude, Fanon's call for the renewal of culture, he believes that the colonized people has to develop a new identity and a sense of belonging to their own nation rather than to the colonizer's nation. This process involves the rejection of the colonizer's culture and the creation of a new culture. This new culture is based on the values and traditions of the colonized people and is achieved through the dynamic role of the native intellectual. Thank you very much.